I know we're all here to hear from our panel, so I want to jump over to that part of our event today. So just to kick us off, I'm going to go ahead and share the panelists who are here with us, and then ask them to share a little bit about their particular frameworks for philanthropy, how it is that they approach philanthropy and identifying nonprofit organizations for support. So our panel includes Faith Boettger, founder and chair of Social for Good Giving Circle, Michael Thatcher, president and CEO of Charity Navigator, Aisha Alexander-Young, CEO of Giving Gap, Iara Peng, founder and CEO of JustFund, and Kelsey Barowich, program and campaign manager at Philanthropy Together. So we have a really nice range of panelists who are going to be speaking from their various perspectives. So maybe I'll just kind of pass it around. And Faith, why don't you start us off with a quick intro and your particular framework for philanthropy.
Hi, good afternoon and welcome. I, like you, sat in this chair looking at starting a new giving circle 9 years ago with the Business Women's Giving Circle and 4 years ago with Social for Good. So the lens I bring is trying to help you avoid some of the drama and pitfalls in organizing your giving circle.
Fantastic. Thank you, Faith. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Emily, and hi, everyone. Charity Navigator is an online resource. We're essentially a free place for you to come and find and look at and get information on 1.6 million registered charities in the United States. We have ratings on about 200,000 of the 1.6 million, and the rating is looking at sort of 4 key areas: leadership and adaptability, culture and community, impact and results, and then finally accountability and finance. We also we have hot topics based on topical events that are happening in the world that help you hone in on organizations that are actually addressing that have strong ratings with Charity Navigator. And literally, we're here to just try and help you in your philanthropic process, and don't charge the charities, don't charge the donors. So it's a free service.
Aisha, over to you.
Thank you, Emily. I am Aisha Alexander-Young, and I am the CEO of Giving Gap. Giving Gap is an online platform that helps people learn about and donate to Black-founded organizations. So we were both birthed out of a moment when people were looking to give to Black organizations after the murder of George Floyd, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the racial justice uprising, and realized that though over $400 billion are donated to nonprofits annually, just a fraction of a percent of those dollars go to Black-founded and Black-led organizations. And part of that was an information challenge, and the ability to be able to discover those organizations was not there. And so we offer the only platform that disaggregates nonprofit data by race to be able to help you find and learn about the Black nonprofits that are working across the country in any issue area. I come to this work with expertise in racial equity and have worked in local government, nonprofits, and philanthropy, institutional philanthropy for the past 20 years now, and really excited to have this conversation with you all today.
Iara, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yada, like yada, yada, yada. I'm the founder and CEO of JustFund. I started building JustFund 7 years ago when I was just struck by, as Aisha mentioned, the disparity in distribution that we as philanthropy have in terms of giving to white-led versus BIPOC-led, Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations. And we really sought to dismantle some of the bottlenecks to giving and really streamline the process for organizations and for funders who are trying to distribute funds. And we leaned into the nation's first national common grant application to make it super simple for organizations to apply for funding. We run about 100 funds on JustFund's platform. We have about 8,000 organizations on the platform who've come in to apply for funding, making it a wonderful portal for individual donors and foundations to come and find and fund organizations that are new to their networks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yada. Kelsey, over to you.
Hi, y'all. My name is Kelsey. I work at Philanthropy Together, and I use they, them pronouns. Philanthropy Together, just for folks to know, is we're a global initiative on a mission to democratize and diversify philanthropy through the power of giving circles. Specifically, we try to showcase giving circles that we really admire, scale by starting and launching new giving circles, strengthen them by offering numerous resources, which we'll get to that later in our talk, and overall just try to make sure that this amazing collective giving movement is thriving. My background, prior to philanthropy, I'm actually a new kid on the block, just for folks to know. Was in public policy and state government here in Massachusetts, but also in grassroots organizing and movement work. Really excited to be here with you all today and talk about building authentic relationships rooted in trust and mutual care. So with that, I'll pass it back.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, everyone. So wonderful to have you here, and so nice to see all of the intros coming in the chat. Thanks, everyone, for sharing where you're dialing in from. Such a nice community across the country we have today. Okay, so jumping in, I would love to just have each of you share one key piece of advice for what people should look for when identifying a nonprofit partner. And I ask this, I think this is a good way to kick off our conversation, because right now we have a lot of new people joining giving circles, leading giving circles, and they're coming up on their first granting meeting, and they're thinking about, how do I even think about identifying a nonprofit that I might want to bring forward for the group to consider? So maybe I'll start with you, Aisha. What would you like to share?
Sure. So I think you asked for one, but I'll give a couple. The first thing that I ask people to make sure they're taking a look at is lived experience. So I can't underscore enough the importance of making sure organizations who are working on a particular cause or issue, that they have leadership and staff who have experienced the issue that they're working on. You know, if you are working on homelessness issues, how do you engage people who have actually experienced homelessness? Because we can't speak to a solution for a problem if we don't really if we've never had any direct experience in it. So whether it's, you know, at the board level, the leadership level, staff, or when they're building their strategy, how do they make sure that they're pulling in information from people who actually have lived experience? And do those people that have lived experiences on those issues, do they have the ability to shape the strategy to make decisions? I think that's a really important screen to ask when you're talking to organizations. And then the second piece that I'll just offer really quickly is that we all tend to support direct service organizations, which are really important and are doing really critical work, and we see them often. But I also just advise people to make sure that while you're supporting organizations that are, you know, treating the symptoms of any issue, that you're also looking at organizations that are healing the wounds. So the organizations that are doing systems change work, and their work isn't as, you know, visible, the outcomes don't come as quickly, but their work is critically important to solving the issues that we all care about.
Great, thank you, Aisha. Excuse me, Kelsey, do you want to jump in?
Sure. You must have seen me snapping in agreement. I'm sorry if that's distracting for anyone. It's a habit pulled from pre-pandemic in-person gatherings that I've never quite broken. I really want to lift up what Aisha was saying. Having folks who have experienced and lived through the issues that are trying to be solved by the organizations is absolutely critical, full stop. And then within that too, I think the other piece that is really important to me when I'm looking at organizations is making sure that there's that authentic relationship with community. And so I highly encourage you, for those of you who are based in really local giving circles, get out there in your community, get to know the organizations that are doing the work, you know, who's out there knocking doors, who is getting folks registered to vote, and what are the folks who are registered or getting their door knocked saying about these organizations? Is that trust there? Have they been there historically? I think, you know, with systems change work, a lot of times folks sometimes think about election season, but even when election season passes, these communities are here. And so I think the other thing too, when thinking about nonprofits and selecting them, some of us sometimes are like, oh, I know and love the nonprofit, let me put them aside. They absolutely cannot be nominated because I already love them. But consider why you might already love them or why the community might already love them, and make sure we're supporting them, particularly those smaller groups who sometimes don't always get the support from larger institutions. But big props to what Aisha was saying. Took the words right out of my mouth. Those were the first two things I thought about.
No, that's a great addition too, Kelsey. Thank you. One of the things that we heard in the last event that we did with Joy Webb was community knows what community needs. So getting out there in the community where you are and learning first is a great approach. Thank you for sharing that. Michael, do you want to go next?
Sure, and I'm approaching this, or let's say Charity Navigator is approaching this from a much broader lens, which could include community work, but it can also include an animal shelter in your neighborhood. And so it's one of the things that if I were to try and distill it down to one thing, I guess I'd say performance matters. So you need to bring these other filters into your thinking and how you choose an organization, the lived experience, but you also want to figure out that the organization's actually achieving or moving in a direction towards what you're seeking to have done. And so there are different ways of looking at that. It can be as simple as asking them what their mission statement is, and then what's their progress towards achieving their mission. But again, I'll leave it at that one simple thing: performance matters.
Great, thank you, Michael. Yara, please.
So I would offer also maybe a different lens to think about this as well. And just a reminder that philanthropy was designed to be society's risk capital, right? I mean, it was designed to take risks. We need to solve systemic issues. We need to get closer and closer to the solution. And we get there by taking risks. Not everything's going to work. And that's good. Like, that's what philanthropy is supposed to do. So just with that lens, I think it sort of takes the pressure off to have to get it exactly right the first time in terms of the grants that we're giving. That origin to me is really helpful. I think, you know, the number one piece of advice I would have is to get out of your personal network. And so I say that risk because it can feel risky to fund groups you don't know, or groups that are not led by your community, you know, as Aisha was saying. How do you find BIPOC-led groups if you don't know them, if they're not in your personal network? So I would just really encourage us to get out of our personal networks. That could be doing, you know, local research. It could be also exploring funding funds that you trust, or funds that are activist-led, you know, or participatory led, and take your dollars and join with other funders to really get to know other organizations through that fund model, where you might feel like you're lowering your risk by joining in a collaborative fund. I mean things like Decolonizing Wealth, which is one fund that, you know, JustFund manages all of their giving, all of their grant making, and they also use Grapevine to collect their small dollar donations. But, you know, if you trust someone like Edgar Villanueva, you could, you know, fund the fund and then get to know multiple organizations that are outside your personal network and then do a direct contribution. So just thinking about, how do we fund folks we don't know?
Thank you, Yada. That's great. It reminds me too of this giving circle model, especially for those people on the call who are joining a new giving circle for the first time. You're already expanding beyond your immediate network, right? And so hopefully through that experience, you're going to discover nonprofits that you've never heard of before and get to learn through each other, really expand your own network by, you know, leveraging each other's networks. But I love that concept of risk capital. And it's something I think also with giving circles, we've seen a lot where giving circles can move much more quickly and take bigger risks than some of the larger philanthropic foundations and others that have, more kind of infrastructure to deal with, it's harder to move. So I think that's a really good point for everyone to consider. I'd love to just jump over to you for a minute, Faith, and you bring this more actionable perspective as a founder and a member, a leader of a couple of different giving circles. So I'm wondering what tips you have for people as they're thinking about going through their granting process for the first time.
Well, I want to play on what Yada said, which I truly and firmly believe as a reformed banker. I preach a lot in the actual conversations that we have about awarding grants that we should take a portfolio approach of awarding grants to nonprofits. And what I mean by that is that there are some that are very tried true. They have demonstrated outcomes. They're doing amazing work. They are led by organizations that just get it done. And then there are a lot of organizations that are new. They are either bringing a tried and true program to a new location. They're trying something different. So having that balanced approach where you are taking a little risk in those that know what they're doing and a lot of risk in those that are trying something new really does give your giving circle an opportunity to make a difference and also see what happens. And again, to Yada's point, it really does give giving circles that flexibility to see what they can do in their communities based on their mission. But a couple of other things I do want to just mention from the ground up, you are going to see some drama within your giving circle. It is human nature that people are so excited about the nonprofits that they know and love. And it's leadership's responsibility to create an organization that constantly delivers the message that every grant you award is winning, and that by giving money to the nonprofits that you've selected, you're making a difference, and that you're also raising visibility for those nonprofits that may not get funded. So you are introducing your network of Giving Circle members to a broad range of nonprofits. I also, really would suggest that you identify your appetite for analysis. For many giving circles, this has a wide range. For the Business Women's Giving Circle, we are run out of the Community Foundation. We have a very formal grants process. We are looking at impact, outcomes, populations served. What are they doing? How are they doing? Who are the leaders? And we go all the way through to a Shark Tank-like presentation, and we award tens of thousands of dollars. For Social for Good, we look at 120 words. What's the mission and what would our members do? What are we doing on the ground? And then for many of the giving circles, I think each of you are looking to present and fund. You are throwing some names in a hat, pulling somebody out and giving them the opportunity to present what they do and voting on it. So it's really key that you understand what your organization's appetite is for analysis, what your ability to resource that analysis is, and then take it from there and go.
Great. Thank you so much, Faith. It's a really great way to bring it back to these specific models. And I'm sure a lot of people here are, I think we have all of those models represented here on the call today. So Faith, I wonder if we can actually stay with you for a moment, because I'd love to talk about what it is that you think is key for giving circles to establish prior to considering nonprofits and selecting nonprofits. Anything you want to share on that topic?
Sure. So I think from my perspective, there are three critical issues that you should address within your giving circle to really minimize the interpersonal dynamics of nominating nonprofits and make a difference. And it is mission, process, and leadership. So the first around mission. We Are for Good said earlier this week in a podcast I listened to, it's not about giving, it's about belief. And as your giving circles are getting started, or you are in an existing giving circle and you're evaluating what you do, it's really important that every single member has a true sense of what is the change you want to create and who's the community you want to serve, because that's really where you're giving your dollars. And it minimizes people's disappointment in how their favorite nonprofit didn't get funded. If you're constantly looking at how does this support your mission and how does your giving, your activities, and everything you do revolve around that mission. And I think having that founding principle really gives you that guiding star where everyone rallies around. The second is process. I talked a little bit about this before, but for both giving circles that I'm in, we leverage our mission, whether it's girls in STEM or for Social for Good, it's meeting local critical needs. But for both of them, we have a process where our members know how we engage nonprofits, how we vet nonprofits, how we vote on nonprofits, and how we award money or time or resources. So having that process is really important. And, you can go as easy as putting things in a hat and pulling out names, or you can go deep dive and create an entire process for grant selection. It's really designed around your group. And then finally, it's leadership. I think that if you don't have leaders who are truly well-versed in your mission and your process to guide it through nomination, through selection, you won't really get to the point where everyone feels that it's been a democratic decision. And, the challenge is that everyone has their own opinion, but managing this process is something that is so critically important. So again, mission, process, leadership, once you start there, you are ready to go.
Great, thank you, Faith. Okay, well, I'd like to bring it back to the rest of the group to talk a little bit about what are some of the resources that you can share with our Giving Circle leaders to identify nonprofits, and then what are some of the questions that they should be asking these nonprofits as they're considering them. For many of our groups, they'll have a nonprofit, they'll have a discussion with the nonprofit that they're considering, and they'll have that opportunity to discuss with the nonprofit. Or they might even be a group where a member needs to nominate a nonprofit, and they might want to connect with that nonprofit in advance and ask some questions before they decide whether or not to nominate them. So anyway, to get us started on this one, Yada, would you like to jump in with this?
Sure. I mean, I think, I really loved what Faith was saying, and, the image of picking names out of a hat once, groups have been nominated, to me, it reminds me of the Go Grants model that Brenda Solenzarno, who's one of the founders of Trust-Based Philanthropy, has built, where once you decide the criteria, it should be an automatic process from there. Once the criteria has been determined for what you want to give to, what kind of groups you will want to support, then there should be a green light go at that point. There's not a lot of discussion that needs to happen there. And in fact, she's automated their grant making over at Headwaters Foundation once a group fits the criteria that's been decided. I think that's an incredible model and something that speaks to, having a very low extractive process, so being as making sure that the process that we're using to identify organizations and to decide on organization that we're funding is not extractive to the groups at all. So, a lot of folks think that trust-based philanthropy equals relational philanthropy, and that's not true, right? I mean, I was in a meeting with Pia Infante, who's one of the founders of trust-based philanthropy, and she said that, and I had to stop her to say, what do you mean? I sort of had associated the two as one and the same. And she said, think about it. If you expect to be in relationship with every group that you're funding or want to fund, what does that mean for the organization? How much time are they spending now educating you, high extraction, about the issue and what they're doing? So I think the lens around identifying groups we want to fund is, to Faith's point, let's get really clear about what the group wants to do. And then we can kind of narrow down the groups we're talking to at that point. So we're approaching it from a just place.
That's great. Thank you so much, Yada. Really interesting points, the low extractive process. And it's something we talk about with Giving Circles, like not trying to put too much work on the nonprofit, right? Especially as we're pooling money, we might be giving $5,000 or $10,000. Faith's group might be giving $20,000. Some of these groups give a decent amount, but it's still a relatively low grant, right? So to ask for a lot from the nonprofit for that is an extractive thing. We wouldn't want to do that. So this model, I think, can really enable us to take more of that low extractive process. Kelsey, I saw you kind of jumping in and getting excited with what Yada was saying. Do you want to share anything more on that?
Sure. So it's funny because when I heard and read this question, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me, similar to what Yada was saying, is, what questions are you asking yourself? Think about the different forms of power, and that can there's so many different ways power shows up in our lives. That can be money, that can be relationships. If we're talking about work environment, it can be who's the CEO and who's the associate, right? And so I think for me, the first step before you even ask nonprofits is to say, okay, yes, I'm giving 25K or I'm giving 1000K, you know, do I need to ask the nonprofit for something? And then the other thing too within that I personally would expand is the piece about what we mean when we say ask. I think for a lot of folks, the first thing they think of is, okay, I'm going to email the executive director and I'm going to say, tell me this about your organization. However, in this day and age with the internet, with social media, so many questions about nonprofits can be answered just by like doing a deep dive online. So one of the things that I'll share is at Philanthropy Together, we host these things at times called pop-up giving circles. And so usually within a pop-up giving circle, it's not as local based, it's usually a topic based. It could be girls in STEM, it could be climate justice. We don't always know what the topic will be until we meet with the folks who we're doing the pop-up with. And so knowing that some of the tools that we use, knowing that this is usually a small dollar donation, it's usually a couple $1,000s. We might not be giving in communities that we have direct relationships with. So things that I'm looking at when I'm trying to answer questions, I'm looking at places like GuideStar and Charity Navigator, not as a like, if I don't see everything I'm looking for, you're out, but just rather as a like, let's see what's on the table here. Let's see how big the budget is. Is this, you know, gift of $2,000 really going to make a huge impact? I will look on their social media. What does their Instagram look like? What are they posting about? What language are they using? Which often will say a lot about where the organization is at. Who are they highlighting in their work? And then the other thing too is seeing where, you know, online, what are their mission? The one caveat that I will say about doing online research is sometimes the organizations that are doing the best work, they're not going to have that clean cut, like jammy Instagram profile or even website. Like one of my favorite organizations, and I'm not going to name them here today. When I first saw their website, I was like, oh boy, what is going on here? And then the deeper I dived into the way they were talking about their problems, who was on their board, their way of trying to change the systems around them, their theory of change, that was where you saw the like, okay, these folks have a spark. They're really rooted in their community. They're dedicated to bringing up folks who have those lived experiences, and they're dedicated to building power specifically in their community, not just doing direct service work. So just to summarize, what I would really encourage folks to do is look at how power shows up in your organization or your giving circle. Look how power shows up in your giving. And then from there, ask yourself, what questions can you answer before going to the nonprofit or org? And then from there, if you are still going to have that conversation, is there a way that you can potentially compensate them for that? You know, maybe it's still giving them a grant if you have those resources. You know, maybe instead of doing a specific one-to-one chat, you kind of go stealth and decide to volunteer for the org and just see, you know, as a volunteer, what's going on. There's a lot of ways to do it to kind of subvert those traditional power dynamics and not, you know, further uplift inequality in your giving.
Thank you, Kelsey. So much good information in there. And I love that specific recommendation too. If you are going to reach out to the nonprofit after doing all of that research on your own, think about how you can compensate them for that. I think a lot of the people in our giving circles talk about wanting to connect with nonprofits to not only support them through the giving circle with funding, but also volunteer time. So I really like that idea of offering to volunteer in exchange for a conversation about whatever the questions might be before you bring them to your group. Michael, that was a great shout out to Charity Navigator from Kelsey. Do you want to go next? And then
I'd
Aisha,
love to.
is that okay?
Yeah, no, I mean, the thing, a lot of this is a process of elimination. You know, if you look globally, there are about 10 million nonprofits. Nationally, there are about 1.6 million. And so do your own, in other words, do your own homework. Don't make the charity do the homework for you. And tools like Charity Navigator we're essentially aggregating as much data as we can to make it easier for you. So Our ratings are made up of some of GuideStar's information, particularly demographic information, how we listen information. We also gather data from the IRS 990, and then we're also collecting it directly from charities. The whole point is to make this as low touch as possible for the charities so that the donors who are doing their initial research can get that free and easily, and then start making selections based on geographic region, demographic composition of the leadership of the organization, lived experience, all these things. These are sort of secondary areas. We're not going to help you with that, but you've got to do that before you actually start doing any outreach. And ultimately, it's about getting really specific because there are too many choices. And I think the beauty for me, what I love about giving circles is how it allows you to sort of share some of the labor of the research of philanthropy to other members of the circle, and do it in such a way that it can be responsible and then highly effective as you build relationships with the organizations you finally choose to support.
Thank you, Michael. That's great. Aisha, yeah, please.
So I would second everything that has been said. You know, I'm approaching this from an equity perspective, and so I'm going to get a little bit into the nitty gritty here. And you know, Michael's one of my board members, and creating Giving Gap, we reference Charity Navigator's ratings to help us decide what organizations are going to be on the Giving Gap platform. But one resource that I would recommend is givinggap.org to be able to help you find Black-led and Black-founded organizations in your area, are working on any particular issue area. We don't have every single Black-led organization on our platform, though that's something that we are working towards. But I really recommend that giving circles take stock of how they're doing their giving annually to ensure that they are doing so from an equity perspective. And so I put in the chat 5 little questions that I would recommend giving circles asking themselves, and individual donors asking themselves. Now, I won't go through each of them, but the one thing I would really recommend that you do is take stock together. And this doesn't have to be like a formal analysis. It could be an open-ended conversation, or it could be a formal analysis, but have the conversation together around what does your giving, how you're allocating your dollars, what does it say about your morals, the communities you value, and whose leadership that you trust? And does that align with who you want to be as a person and who you all want to be as a giving body? And, you know, you could switch out in each of these questions. My focus is on Black-led organizations. You could switch that out to, you know, BIPOC organizations or Latinx organizations, or whatever issue that you're specific on. But if you take inventory on how you're giving, be very intentional about asking yourself some questions every year, or a couple of times a year, doing some analysis and being really introspective around what your giving is saying, and how you're being intentional about your giving. And I love, you know, what we've been talking about and what Faith has been saying about, you know, there's different models, and some of us, we may just be, I'm in a couple of giving circles. I'm in one that's really intentional. I'm definitely in one that we're kind of shaking up names in a hat, right? But the opportunity to be really introspective and ask yourself some questions about, are you being intentional about your giving, even if you're shaking them up in a hat, and redirecting if it's not aligning with the values that you hold is extremely important.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Great questions too in the chat. Thank you for sharing those. And I saw some other resources being shared earlier in the chat too. So thank you for sharing that out. Gabby, I think we have some consolidated resources, right? Maybe we could drop those in the chat now as well. And we'll be collecting additional notes from what you've all shared here today, and might share and follow up to this conversation and make sure to add those. But we've aggregated a few of these resources you've been sharing in one place for everyone. So I do want to ask, because we get this question sometimes from groups, what are some things I should be looking out for? are there any red flags that I should just keep an eye out for as I'm considering a nonprofit as a potential partner? I'm going to just ask whoever wants to respond to this question, please go ahead and do so, because I think maybe we'll have a couple of people.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I mean, I think, you know, the low bar here is let's do no harm, right? As funders. And so, I mean, we're, the number one thing I would say is making sure that the funds that we're distributing are doing no harm. And that means running our grants or our gifts through a hate screen. So I know that Grapevine already has a hate screen up for you, so that, you know, if you were to input an EIN to give, it would pop up. I think, Emily, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, you know, but thinking about resources like Horizon Forum, which has aggregated, I think, 5 different hate screens and have a list of organizations and their EINs that you can run, you know, your ideas by, just to make sure you don't inadvertently fund someone who's doing, you know, really, really bad things. So, I mean, just as the lowest bar, let's make sure that our giving is doing no harm. I'll stop there.
I can sort of add on to that, and it's also, it really is a low bar, but it's if you care about giving to a 501c3, make sure it's a 501c3 and not a masquerade, you know, not a fake charity masquerading to be a 501c3. And that's, again, you have GuideStar, Charity Navigator. Again, we'll actually give you that information. The other thing that we look at that is some people care about, and this might be important to you, is active investigations by an attorney general's office, or any kind of misconduct that may have been reported by a credible journalist. These are things, I'm not saying you shouldn't give, but they're things you should take into consideration. And so I think we've, you know, Kelsey, I think you made the point that so much of this information is already available on the internet. These are potential flags that might slow you down, or have you asked slightly different questions to the nonprofits as you get into it? Because just because there's an attorney general's investigation of your organization, there may be a really valid reason for it, and that the leader of the organization should be able to speak to that.
Yeah, and just to chime in too is, you know, I think within red flags, there are actual red flags, and then there are red flags that, you know, frankly can uplift inequity, right? And so things that I'm thinking about is like professionalism and unpacking what professional means to you and your group, and why it means, like, why it might be so important, right? Like, are you looking on a group's Instagram page and saying, wow, that language was really informal and therefore I don't want to donate to them? You know, that often is bringing in power dynamics that we were talking about earlier that would block folks from funding. On the flip side of the 501c3 status, I think one thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is, for many historically and traditional funders, that one of their red flags is groups that don't have a history of funding. Now, we know that historically, traditional philanthropy is not great about funding BIPOC folks, queer folks. And so when you add that analysis onto the history of funding, what an inequitable red flag. And that's one of the things that I personally really love about giving circles and collective giving models, is because this is an opportunity for you to look at that red flag and say, actually, we've done our due diligence at this for this organization. We know they're amazing, and we want to take that risk. Just like we've been talking about earlier, we want to uplift the work of this org. And just to highlight like a on the ground story, through the pandemic, I worked at the Mass Redistribution Fund, which was organizing folks to redistribute their stimulus checks to folks building power in the community of Massachusetts. And we had a group that, because they got a grant from us, ultimately was then able to apply to a foundation and get foundation dollars. What a powerful moment within, like, essentially redistributing power and equity. And that's the type of power that your giving circles have. So really make sure that as you're like creating that list of like, okay, this is the big, like, we need to go back to the group and say, hey, this isn't right. Make sure you're not, you know, picking up red flags that maybe don't need to be on that list.
Thank you all for those responses. I think some really good nuggets in there. Yara, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to
I
add
was
anything?
just gonna, thanks so much. I was just gonna, emphasize this point of what you said, Kelsey, which I think is so important, because there are historically excluded communities from philanthropy, who've been chronically underfunded. Expecting groups who have a part-time ED and no development director to have the same type of infrastructure as these larger, more established organizations is just unfair. So I think it's really important for us, like you were saying, Kelsey, if you think it's a red flag, just think, let's just look at what we've been doing as a sector in philanthropy, and the chronic underfunding of our most vulnerable communities means that we may see infrastructure look differently, and it should be a reason for us to go all in, I think. I do. That's what my family does with our family foundation and our DAFs and the giving circles that I'm a part of, and what I'm seeing on JustFund, where folks are leaning into the common grant application. It's 4 questions. We don't need to ask a lot to actually get our money out the door. And then, to Aisha's great point, let's evaluate what happened, and we can make better decisions after we've done that first grant. Again, let's just take some risk. That's what we're designed to do.
Fantastic. Michael, are you?
Yeah, I'm moving away from your question, because particularly what Yara was saying is, and I think we're all saying it, you're investing in something. You're not just giving money away, right? So, and in any investment, you're going to follow it. And we tend to use evaluation. And I said earlier, it's a process of elimination. But once you choose somebody, it's a relationship, and guess what? They're going to fail. And you've got to stay involved. That's actually when you give them more money or give them more people. And as a giving circle, you have such an opportunity with that. So it really is about staying engaged, staying involved, do your due diligence, but then be there for them when they need you versus give and run.
Love that. Thank you. Thank you all for that.
I want to bring that back to what I talked about earlier, which is how you establish your giving circle. Are you a transactional giving circle where you are making a grant and then moving on to your next cycle? Or are you investing in nonprofit partners? And those look very different. It looks very different from a organization standpoint. It looks different from a leadership standpoint, and it looks different from a resourcing standpoint. So if you're giving money and you're walking away, you're still doing good, but you're not doing what Michael just mentioned. You're not tracking, was this a good use of our funds? How do we learn from this? How do we leverage going forward? But it really does come back to that grown-up decision of who do you want to be and how do you want to give your money away? And I think that's truly important. I think also, you've all said this many times, and I'm just going to say it in a little bit of a different way. The best written application for a grant is not always the best use of your funds. I've seen amazingly horrible written applications that their programs are incredible and they are life-changing, but they don't have the resources to pay someone to write an amazing grant. So it's hard. We all have to learn to put our red pens down and not try to edit what somebody did, but to truly understand the difference that that organization is trying to make. I put a link in the chat for the unfunded list, and I highly recommend that if you find grants, grant applications that are not beautiful, do not seem like robust opportunities, push them to take a look at submitting their application to the unfunded list. It will be reviewed by a global group of individuals who will give them some feedback on their process.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your thoughts here and for that, Faith. I think we often get that question from giving circles, like what about the organizations that didn't receive the grant? What can we do to still show support? And so I think that's a great example right there, adding them to the unfunded list. In addition to other things, one of the things we talk about with giving circles are the 4 T's. And I think this is maybe more broadly in the philanthropic space, but it's time, talent, treasure, and testimony, right? So these being 4 different ways that you can invest in, to your point, Michael, the organizations, the community. So treasure, yes, making that donation. but these other three, time, talent, and testimony, advocating for them, sharing them out with other opportunities, I think is really valuable to keep in mind. I know we're just at time. I do want to just kind of ask this last question though for all of us, because one thing that we see with a lot of giving circles is they end up having a finalist group of organizations that they're considering that are working on a wide variety of topics. So it could be, animal rights to poverty alleviation or food insecurity, or just a wide range of things. And so it can be a little challenging to think about effectiveness, about where their dollar can go the furthest, about how to how to consider organizations so different from each other in any given specific decision. Any thoughts from any of you on that? Yes, please, Kelsey.
I would love to jump in. This is a question that is really, really personal to me as someone who very often suffers from decision paralysis in every facet of my life. So first piece is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There have been times where I have donated to orgs and I look back and I'm like, oh my God, why did I do that? But if at least I got the ball rolling, I took the first step, which then led me to be able to take the next step and eventually get to a place where I'm like, actually, this is what's most in alignment with my values. And I feel really, really good about this decision. And honestly, 5 years from now, that might change, and that's okay. These systems of oppression and inequality were not built in a day, and they're not going to be taken down in one day. And we have to make mistakes in order to dismantle this inequality, which is just so much bigger than our giving, but that's the first piece. And then the other piece that I just want to name is recognize that none of you are alone in this space. You are in the collective giving movement. You are in a giving circle with your peers. No one giving circle is going to solve every problem that you are funding or that you are supporting. And so I think particularly in an age with a 24-hour news cycle, it's really easy to see a problem and then be like, oh my God, we need to donate here. And then another problem comes in, you're like, never mind, we're not going to do climate justice, we're going to do immigration. And just remember, it's okay to focus on one subject area, and it's okay to do deep dives into those subject areas and recognize that you have a group of people, even beyond what you know, that are also trying to support organizations. And then I would also say, if something is really striking a nerve with you, go out and do it outside of your giving circle. And or, maybe you see an organization that you love and your giving circle didn't donate to them. Can you donate to them as an individual? Can you volunteer with them? Maybe your giving circle as a group says, we really love this group, but we decided to go with the other one. Let's just do a volunteer day, or let's just try to make sure that we're continuing to support this group. We bring them back into our process. One of the things that helps me when I'm feeling that oh my God, I want to help everyone, or I want to support all of these projects, is just even looking at the lists of organizations that I admire or funders that I admire, and say, right, we're not the only ones funding it. So just to close, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And then the other thing that I like to tell myself as a mantra is, we are all we really have. And so just know it doesn't have to be all on you, because you have a community around you. So.
Thank you, Kelsey. Anyone else?
Faith can probably speak better to this than I can, but I think it goes back to a lot of things that she was saying in the beginning, in the first the question that you asked her, Emily. But I think just moving with intention, I think that it's really important to have conversations with your giving circle in any community around what you all value. What is your intention? And so then when you're making decisions, you're able to do it to make sure that it's in alignment with whatever values you all have stated. And when you find yourself off track, you're able to come back to, well, this is what we said we value, and this is what we said our intention is. So either, we're moving away from that, or we need to take a look at our values and intention again and see if it belongs someplace else. And so I think you have to have those tough conversations to create a frame, because there's so much being done, and there are so many worthy organizations. And, I do think it's important to make sure you're compounding your impact. That's the reason you're in a giving circle, right? And so while you're just one group and there's many others out there, to be able to move with intention, I believe is really important.
Thank you.
I'll say at JustFund, we say money moves at the speed of trust, and I find that to be true in any way you slice it. So whether it's freeing up your time on the transactional side so you can focus on the transformative side of grant making as a giving circle, like really reduce your administrative side so that your time is freed up to do the relationships with each other, because that's how money is going to move, as you build trust with each other, and of course with the organizations in your community.
If I could, the one thing I'd add, and this may sound self-serving, but I mean, one of the reasons, and Kelsey, I'm at Charity Navigator because I couldn't make up my mind, and I figured if I'm working on nonprofit infrastructure, then I'm actually having a greater impact across a huge variety of areas. And I would assume that each and every one of us in our organizations are all working on that. And so one thing is invest in nonprofit infrastructure or in philanthropic infrastructure. It's a grossly underserved community that really needs help, because we're trying to actually help the specific communities, but there's a lot that's needed to improve how we help you in your philanthropy.
Love that, Michael, as a fellow nonprofit infrastructure founder. Okay, I would love to, we are just about at time, but we do have enough time for a couple of questions. So thank you everyone for your wonderful responses and for sharing. I'd love to take a couple of questions if you have one, and if you can be succinct so we can try and get a couple in, that would be great. Go ahead and raise your hand, or you can go ahead and drop them in the chat. Letitia, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to share?
Yes, and I'll be very, very quick. So my question is, and I think it was Michael who made the comment that made me think about this question, is if there are programs or projects that are leveraging a fiscal sponsor to gain that nonprofit status, if you will, is that a red flag? Should we not consider those for giving opportunities?
Not a red flag.
Not a red flag.
Not a red flag.
Especially when you think about our most vulnerable communities who don't have the money or the knowledge to start a nonprofit. It's actually, a smart way to set up the program quickly. So you're leveraging the infrastructure of the fiscal sponsor.
I'm not saying it's
an extra layer of security.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's a green flag, but just for context, like philanthropy, like we are fiscally sponsored, right? So it's normal. It's okay, because it's hard to become a 501c3.
We just got 501c3 status after a year and a half. A lot of effort and time went into that. So I think it's actually very smart, for those who just want to get started. Thank you for that great question, Letitia. And